Today, we just got our biggest update on the Final Fantasy VII re-trilogy that we've gotten in some time. We're going to be talking about DLC, potential new Final Fantasy VII spin-offs, and more, so go ahead and hit that subscribe button, because we got a lot to dive into today. I think this is one of the biggest updates that we've had in quite a long time. So this interview comes via dailystar.co.uk, and one of the big things that Hamaguchi says here is do not expect DLC for Rebirth. So if you're hoping for something like an intermission, like the Yuffie DLC for Part 1, it doesn't look like we're going to be getting anything like that for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, unfortunately. He says, quote, "We definitely do hear the desire from fans, the voices out there that want that kind of thing." Hamaguchi said, request for a DLC or expansion. I understand it completely, but I think from my perspective, what the fans really want to see the most is not necessarily the DLC. They want to see the third part of the series as quickly as possible. So that's why we've decided not to focus the development resources on creating additional extra episodes for DLC at the moment. We really are putting all our effort into getting the third game out as quickly as we can. So for the moment, that's where we're focusing our time. I completely agree. Listen, the reason we even want the DLC in the first place is to hold us over until the next part. Wouldn't it just be a smarter move to go ahead and get the next part as soon as possible? Because he's right, that's the thing that we really want. Yes, it is nice to have that thing that holds you over in between, but if the same developers have to stop and then make that DLC, then really it's just kind of defeating the point. As nice as a DLC between Rebirth and whatever Part 3 ends up being called would potentially be, if it has to come at the cost of slowing down the development of Part 3, then it's just not worth doing. Now with Intermission, it did make sense. And the reason it made sense is because the developers wanted to do a test on the PlayStation 5 and get accustomed to the hardware. However, it's assumed that Part 3 is going to be coming out on PS5, God, I hope, and this is not going to be like a PlayStation 6 title. So really, the benefit of trying to release any other DLC really is not there for them. They should go ahead and move on to Part 3. I completely agree with this statement from Naoki Hamaguchi. Next, Hamaguchi talks about the state of the video game industry and the Game Awards itself. And he has some really interesting commentary. But before we go any further, I want to let you guys know we are giving away yet another free game this month thanks to our sponsor, Instant Gaming. All you have to do is click the link or pin comment below and then smack that participate button and you can be entered to win. Instant Gaming offers codes from authorized code resellers, meaning that you can get games and codes much cheaper than you normally would. You can even get a $50 PSN gift card for only $43.98. Listen, you were going to buy Dragon Quest III HD 2D anyways, right? So you might as well get it for $10 cheaper than you normally would. Stop throwing away your money and start using Instant Gaming with a link in the description below. And he talks about the polarization of games. This is something that I've talked about quite frequently too, where the AA game, the game that exists between the bleeding edge AAA, God of War, Cyberpunk, and the indie game like Balatro, has kind of disappeared over the years, where nowadays it's either you have this $100+ million title, or this game that was developed literally by one guy. And the things that are in between, not as common anymore. The article says that, quote, "In that time, Hamaguchi has seen a lot of change in the video game industry, and was quick to mention titles like Balatro, which was nominated for Game of the Year at this year's Game Awards and was developed by a single developer. I think that the market is becoming very mature now, and I see a bit of polarization," he explains. You got a really big, blockbuster AAA kind of games, the kind of games I've worked on, and at the same time, you also get the indies, games made very cheaply by small teams of people. I think both of those are doing very well, and it seems to be the middle ground, which is perhaps much more difficult these days for people to make successful games in. So to see we've been nominated in the same lineup as Balatro is kind of showing where we are. I think it's very interesting. The polarization of titles is something that has been happening for a while, though I do think that we begin to see a resurgence of AA games, games that aren't like the most cinematic movie game that you've ever seen, something like Metaphor ReFantazio, which again, mostly using text boxes and not even fully voice acted, something that is probably a lot cheaper to make than something like Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, where every single scene is like a movie, even the most minor dialogue from an NPC is voice acted. Those sorts of things really do add up and make these AAA blockbuster games much more expensive to make. So, you know, me personally, I am all for the resurgence of the AA game. He then talks about the development of the first title and how it led into the development of the second. He says, quote, "When we sat down at the end of Remake Development period, about 6 months before the game came out, we started switching our perception and looking toward the second game. It became fairly clear that the story-driven style of Remake would be quite impossible to do again with the second game, just because we wanted to have that whole world, the world map going out into the wider environment. So essentially, that made the decision very easy for us to switch around and say, no, we're going to focus more on this open world structure, the idea of exploration, etc. Another motivation for that change too was, we knew even before we'd release Remake, was a lot of people were going to say, actually, I wanted to explore the whole city of Midgard completely freely and go anywhere I wanted at any time, and we understood that. I'm going to be the first one to confess here. That was kind of something I was wanting. I did want to go around Midgard and explore Midgard fully. Because we talk about the Remake trilogy allowing Final Fantasy VII to go in the directions that fans have always really wanted to see. And, you know, one thing that I've really always wanted to do is just be able to go anywhere in Midgard, see the upper plate more. I think Midgard is like one of the most fascinating and coolest location in any video game ever made. So yeah, you know what? I'll admit, I am one of those guys. I did want to be able to see more Midgard. I did want to be able to travel throughout more Midgard. I understand why that was not possible. It's because they didn't want to break the plot structure of Final Fantasy VII in order to accommodate for it. It makes sense. I'm not arguing with it. I'm not fighting it. But yeah, I did want to see it. Who here can say they did not want to be able to freely travel around Midgard? Anyway, let's continue with the interview. So how do you expand on the game from 1997 without losing what made its own world map so special? As Hamaguchi explains, it was a difficult task. We felt that was a very big challenge, and the difficulty in developing the second game went way up over what we did for the first game for that very reason. But certainly, when we announced that Remake was going to be a trilogy, the importance of the second game becomes really critical. If we had just basically done the same again with Rebirth that we did for Remake, and have it as another fairly linear, very story-driven experience, players would then have the expectation of, okay, number 1 was like that, number 2 is like that, obviously number 3 is just going to be the same again. People would lose that level of expectation and excitement as to what could be possible from the third game, which is why I very much felt we had to evolve it and expand it, and take it in new directions for Rebirth. Hamaguchi is 1000% correct here. And let's be honest, if Rebirth had came out and it was another very linear and story-driven game like the first one, a lot of people would say, oh, it's just more of the same. You know, when it comes to games like even Tears of the Kingdom and God of War Ragnarok, we hear people saying that, oh, that's just a really big DLC. That's not actually a sequel. Whereas Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, you know, despite being the second part of a remake of one game, it feels more like a sequel than anything else, in the truest sense of the word. And really, I think it was successful, because now whenever I'm thinking of the third part, I'm thinking about the airship. I'm thinking about flying across the world map. Seeing how surprisingly big Rebirth was next to Remake, you know, my expectations for the third part have been elevated even higher. Now I'm like, what can they even do? Where can they even go? You know, like we were worried about how they were going to make like weapon fight works, or how they were going to make like Knights of the Round work and things like that. I am now so not concerned about those things. I know that they're going to have a way to fit those things in and make them incredibly epic, cinematic, and most importantly, fun to play. Like I have a lot of confidence that they're going to be able to achieve that. And a lot of that confidence was built on how Rebirth evolved from Remake. And also too, not just how the game design evolved, but the insane amount of content that they were able to fit into this game. And I really do feel like if they listen to all the feedback from Rebirth, if they implement the things that fans are wanting to see, and they bring this all to a close in a really positive and powerful way, I think it's possible that, at least from a game design perspective, we might be looking at the best Final Fantasy ever made with Part 3. Now, let's talk about the most important thing so many of you always want to talk about in the comment section of every single upload. Turn-based combat. Now, I'm a big turn-based combat stan myself. I love turn-based combat. Now, my love for turn-based combat does not mean that I hate action games. I do love action RPGs. I love turn-based RPGs. I think they can both coexist. And here is what Hamaguchi has to say about the future of Final Fantasy and turn-based. The article says, quote, For a series with so much history, Final Fantasy is almost split between its original turn-based RPG combat and the more cinematic action-based combat seen not only in Rebirth and Remake, but last year's Final Fantasy 16 too. While Hamaguchi certainly respects turn-based combat, it doesn't appear it's primed for a comeback anytime soon. First of all, I'm not going to say turn-based is better than action-based or the other way around, he says. They both got their places, and they both can be really great gaming experiences. I think we've certainly seen that with Metaphor ReFantazio, another Game of the Year nominee, he explains, calling Atlus's latest RPG really great. I will say that in terms of advantages and disadvantages between them, having a more action-based style, it's all down to the input really. The idea that if you push the button, your actions are immediately reflected on screen, which generally leads to a higher level of immersion. I think that is a statement that is hard to refute, though I know quite a few of you will definitely try to refute. But yeah, you know, when the boss is attacking me and I'm having to dodge and parry and consider if the boss has any weaknesses and exploiting them and doing all these sorts of things, it does ultimately make the game feel that much more immersive. Though I do think that with a lot of action RPGs, it can sometimes take away from the role-playing elements in favor of overemphasizing the action, and that's a common criticism of Final Fantasy 16, right? The fact that in Final Fantasy 16 you don't have elemental weaknesses, you don't have buffs and debuffs, you don't have status elements, you don't have control over your party members, and all of this was taken away in favor of emphasizing the action elements and trying to make the action elements thrive more. However, the argument in doing that, the counter argument is, well, now you've made a game that is really superficial as an RPG, you know, with the only real RPG element being that you level up. But there's no sense of RPG strategy, there's no builds, there's no things that really matter to an RPG fan in that sense. And one thing that I do love about Re-Trilogy versus that end of the spectrum, because really, you know, if you think about RPG combat, like action RPG combat, as a spectrum of, we're really leaning into RPG stuff, there's going to be status elements, there's going to be elemental weaknesses, and there's going to be party member control, versus we're going to get rid of that stuff in favor for the action elements. Then Final Fantasy 16 and Rebirth are kind of at opposite ends in that sense. So there is a balancing act. So while I do agree that it is typically more immersive to have your actions reflected on the screen immediately, it sometimes can lead to, specifically from the POV of an RPG enthusiast, I say that slowly so that you don't take it out of context, can lead to like what is perceived as a more shallow experience, again, from the POV of an RPG enthusiast. But I think the real important thing to note here, crucial thing, is that my guy Hamaguchi is playing Metaphor ReFantazio and thinks that it's exceptional. And I agree, brother, that is good turn-based, 100%. My man has impeccably good taste. And now we get to the most controversial part of the interview. This is the part I hope is like a translation error, that there's something, you know, missing here, that this is not reading how it sounds like, because God, I hope it is not what it sounds like. Some of you may really like to hear this. I am not one of those people, and I'll explain why. The article says Final Fantasy VII has seen plenty of spin-offs in the past, as well as the Advent Children movie from 2005. But I was curious if Hamaguchi was considering looking into additional stories in the game's storied universe. Well, he wouldn't commit to anything just yet, as he wants to ensure the third game launches as quickly as possible, and that nothing is in the works at the present. He did say he understands fan requests for additional content in the FF7 universe. I want it, Remake Chapter 3, to come out as quickly as possible, he admits, and then move on to maybe looking at some other stories, dig a bit deeper. There's definitely a call out there to see the other spotlights on the other parts of the world, and the universe, different characters. So I'd like to maybe switch to looking at them in a different way after we've got the third game out. Okay. So it really does sound like this means more Final Fantasy VII spin-off games. Although it is left to interpretation, this could mean, you know, Final Fantasy VII anime, movies, DLC. I do think I would be plenty fine if it is side projects like that. Like if they wanted to make a Final Fantasy VII anime and continue to explore different characters outside of just Cloud and Co., I would be perfectly fine with that. However, if we're talking about digging into Final Fantasy VII, if we are talking about making more FF7 spinoffs, if we're talking about making a eulogy of Katesip and him getting like his own game, or if we're talking about anything other than that, for me personally, that's kind of where I would have to draw a line. I do think it's entirely possible that one thing that he's really talking about here is a remake of Dirge or Cerberus, because I do think that there are people out there who would want to see a remake of Dirge. There's also a lot of people out there that would love to see Advent Children made into its own game, or Advent Children even be a DLC for part 3. Like, I think if I were to get my ultimate DLC for part 3, it would definitely be a playable Advent Children DLC. I don't think anything would top that. For me, the remake trilogy would feel really complete at that point. And that's not even to say I necessarily love AC as a film, but I think that there has just always been a desire for people to play Advent Children as a game. And so I think that the complete and ultimate fan service would be to have that be a DLC for part 3, and then let that kind of be the ultimate conclusion to the Final Fantasy VII universe. I think people could probably live without Dirge. I know that there's someone in the comments who's like, actually, NSP, I cannot live without Dirge. I promise you, bro. Little bro, I promise, you can live without Dirge. Listen, I get it. Some of you would be fine with Final Fantasy VII continuing until the end of time. I'm not here to like push back on your desires. You want what you want. If you really love the series, then like, it's not invalid to want more FF7. However, the reason I personally draw that line is because I really want to see Creative Studio 1 move on to other projects. In particular, I want to see Naoki Hamaguchi directing Final Fantasy 17. Not to mention, there are other new Final Fantasy remakes they could be working on, sequels, new IPs, all of which is a lot more valuable to me than just making and milking more FF7. And also, we have to look at things realistically. It's really not like Final Fantasy VII Remake really grew the Final Fantasy brand in this huge exponential way. Like, it's not like it reached millions upon millions of people who've never heard of or never played Final Fantasy VII. That's just objectively looking at the sales. Even part 1 has sold half of what the OG FF7 sold. FF7R is selling 7 million copies, and Final Fantasy VII OG selling over 14 million. So I think what Square Enix needs the most right now is new, fresh ideas, a new fresh world, new fresh characters. Hamaguchi and the team at Creative Studio 1 are the guys that I most trust to continue to deliver that, to make new intellectual property for Final Fantasy and make something really compelling for 17 or 18 or whatever game they'll work on next. And I'd much rather see them doing that then again, making Eulogy of Katesip or whatever they want, whatever next compilation game they want to make. I think that their time and energy is much more better placed doing that. But please, feel free to argue with me on that in the comments below. Let me know your thoughts on all this stuff from the interview. The no DLC, maybe wanting to do more Final Fantasy VII spinoffs. Be sure to check out Instant Gaming, and I'll see you all in the next video. Later, guys.